welcome. You're watching India Today Explains. I'm Akshita Nandagopal, and over the next 30 minutes, I'll break down some of the week's top stories for you. We begin with the week's biggest news story, the India-US trade deal. A whole lot of questions loom on the fine print of the trade deal. We'll tell you exactly what we know so far about what this trade deal looks like between the two countries. And of course, amid a whole lot of tall claims by Trump. One of those claims made by Trump is that India will no longer buy Russian oil. Is that true? And how much of oil does India actually get from Russia? I'll break down those numbers for you. Also on the show, the widespread attacks in Pakistan by Baloch fighters. We'll decode for you what this conflict is about and why Balochistan has seen a whole lot of violence for the last many decades. And finally on the show, there's a new AI platform in town. And no, it isn't for you and me, it's for AI agents. I'll tell you all about Moltbook, the new talk of the town. So lots lined up as always. Let's get started. The much-awaited India-US trade deal is done. On February 2nd, Trump took to social media announcing the India-US trade deal. He called Modi a great friend, said the agreement followed direct talks between the two leaders. Prime Minister Modi soon after followed up with his own social media post calling Trump his dear friend. But what is the trade deal? Well, the agreement is still being finalized. The joint statement is expected, but let me break down what we know so far. For starters, the big headline of tariffs. The trade deal has ensured tariffs on India by America is down from 50% to 18%. And in return, India lowering its tariff on US exports to 0.
एक फॉर्मल एग्रीमेंट ड्राफ्ट हो रहा है जिसको शायद महीना भर 1.5 महीना लग सकता है, लेकिन 18% जो यूएस टैरिफ्स घटने हैं वो जॉइंट स्टेटमेंट अनाउंस होने के बाद एग्जीक्यूटिव ऑर्डर द्वारा यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स ऑफ अमेरिका कर देगा.
What about oil? Well, this has been a bit complicated because Trump in his announcement claimed that India will no longer buy Russian oil, will shift to Venezuelan oil.
A very good relationship. India committed to not only no longer purchasing Russian oil, but buying oil from the United States, also perhaps from Venezuela too, which we know will now have a direct benefit on the United States and the American people.
What's India said on this? Well, the government has said India will continue to buy crude oil from anywhere in the world, whichever suits us, where there are no sanctions based on market rates. India did not buy from Venezuela when sanctions were in place. Now that those sanctions have been lifted, Venezuela is an option too. I will also highlight here that Russia has communicated that there's been no stopping supply of oil to India so far. Now let's talk about agriculture, which was a big sticking point and led to the delay in the trade deal being finalized. What's happened over the past year can perhaps help explain why the agriculture part remains opaque so far. India was determined not to open the floodgates in ways that could destabilize its farm and dairy sectors. It was willing to discuss limited agricultural access. Corn, soybeans, ethanol, dairy consistently emerged as the hardest issues. The United States pushed for access for corn and soybeans, crops that are predominantly genetically modified in America, and also for ethanol linked to corn production. India, however, has long opposed genetically modified food and feed crops and has been unwilling to allow meat-fed dairy products also into Indian markets. So these demands have been politically and socially explosive. The government has maintained that there has been no compromise on the interests of farmers. They say the sensitive sectors in agriculture and dairy that were protected will continue to be protected.
हमने मुख्य अनाज, डेयरी उत्पाद, हमारे प्रमुख फल सबको सुरक्षित रखा है. ऐसा कोई बाजार नहीं खुल रहा जिसमें हमारे किसानों का अहित हो, नुकसान हो.
Now this landmark deal will be definitely a major win for India because it opens up access to global markets with lower tariffs on textiles, leather, gems, automobiles. Indian MSMEs are set to receive a massive boost in exports. The pharma and generic sectors will also benefit significantly, for now pharma is exempt. But the biggest advantage perhaps lies in electronics. The global chip supply chain may shift to India. Additionally, this deal will strengthen IT and services exports and facilitate more access, smoother access to defense and high-tech sectors. In short, This deal has the potential to transform India's trade and technology landscape, but I reiterate, the fine print is still awaited. US President Donald Trump, while announcing the India-US trade deal, made a startling claim that India will stop buying Russian oil and pivot to Venezuelan and US crude. Russia claims India hasn't stopped buying oil. India said, we have multiple sources. But amid all of this, who actually does India purchase oil from? Let's answer that question. India is one of the world's largest crude oil importers, relying on foreign oil for about 85 to 88% of its needs. So in 2024 to 2025, Russia was often India's single largest supplier, accounting for roughly 30 to 35% of imports. Now these volumes sometimes about 1.2 to 1.7 million barrels per day. The second largest source, Iraq, about 18 to 20%, Saudi Arabia at 13 to 15%, and then you have UAE at 8 to 10%. Again, I'll highlight this is data for 2024-25. So you've got that entire ranking there, with number one being Russia. Why does Russian oil then matter to India? Well, post-Ukraine war sanctions pushed Russia to offer deep discounts on crude, making it economically attractive for India's refiners. Indian refineries are configured to process heavier and sour crude, a category where Russian oil often fits well. And that's what boosts refining margins. Buying Russian oil helped India lower its energy import bill and secure supplies when global markets were tight. So Russian oil wasn't just about volume, it was also about affordability and refinery compatibility. So what does US have to say about this? The US has tied trade incentives like lower tariffs on Indian exports to reducing Russian oil imports. Trump explicitly linked these moves to weakening Russia's revenue base, especially in the context of the Ukraine war, and has repeatedly done so. Washington argues that cutting Russian oil buys undermines Moscow's ability to fund military actions and keeps global oil prices in check. And so US policymakers have repeatedly imposed tariffs on countries that import Russian crude, trying to isolate Russia economically. The pressure isn't therefore just diplomatic. It's also tied to trade leverage and global geopolitics. So can India ultimately replace Russian oil? Yes, but there are certain conditions that cannot be ignored. India can source more crude from America, from the Middle East, from Africa, and of course from Venezuela. And analysts say alternatives exist without severe disruption. Venezuelan crude is also heavy and sour, which I was referring to earlier. It's similar to Russian grades, so it's very much attractive for many Indian refiners. But switching suppliers involves huge logistics and pricing challenges. US crude is usually lighter, more expensive once freight is factored in. Also, exiting can be an issue because of the wind-down problem. Even if India decides to scale back Russian oil, it's not something that can happen overnight as Trump suggests. Most crude purchases are governed by long-term supply contracts between Indian refiners and Russian producers, often running for several years. To break a contract will mean that there is a certain wind-down period, meaning buyers must either continue lifting agreed volumes or face penalties. Additionally, a sudden exit could also hurt India's credibility as a long-term buyer in global oil markets. So while yes, diversification is possible, going ahead and delinking yourself from Russian oil is a gradual process, not a switch off. And that's what I keep referring to, the wind down period becomes a major constraint for India. In short, India, yes, has the capacity to diversify, but it will take time, investment and favorable pricing, most importantly, to fully replace discounted Russian barrels. So far, there's no communication from India that suggests that there will be zero purchase of Russian oil.